everyone. I'm going to talk today about recent developments in Southeast Asia. That's the area I consider from Myanmar, Burma, all the way to Timor-Leste, which is the far eastern part of Indonesia, the country that's now about 9 years old. And I wondered how many of you have been to any of those countries? A show of hands, please. Okay, and how many of you think your interest in the countries would be enhanced if you knew something about recent developments there? All right, good. That's what I hope to do today. I thought I would start by telling you a little about how I got interested in this area. People have asked me. From the time I was a little boy, about 10 years old, I used to clip out the articles in the News and the Week in Review, the New York Times, and the principal would let me come in on Fridays to the assembly and give a talk for about 15 minutes during the assembly about what I read in the paper. And then my favorite subject in high school was history. And then I went on to the University of Pennsylvania, as Bob has said, and I thought I was going to be a history major, but then I discovered political science there. And then I learned about international relations, which is a branch of political science. And by about the sophomore year, I took the course in Asian history, and I was hooked. And then I took a year of Japanese history, and I was further hooked. And by the junior year, I was taking, besides the basic political science and international relations courses, I was taking a course in major governments of Southeast Asia. And I found that absolutely fascinating. I went on to the senior seminar in international relations, and Professor Rubinstein, who was the head of the seminar, a Sovietologist, told the class that they would have to write a paper about Sino-Soviet relations toward one of 4 countries in Asia. And I picked Burma, which was one of the 4 countries, mainly because they had 2 communist parties at that time. They're one of the few countries with an old-line Stalinist party, and they also had a Trotskyite party. I thought that would be interesting. That's very typical of the Burmese. If everybody has one, they have 2. They don't agree about a lot of things. And the other reason was most of the writings were in English, and I was just a terrible foreign language student. And I said, well, I'll be able to read most of the scholarly literature. So I did that, and about 150 pages later, I won a prize for it, and I thought, gee, maybe I ought to make this my career. This is an interesting area, and I like teaching, I thought, and I said I'd like to maybe teach college. So I went to Professor Rubinstein, and I said, Professor, I told him the whole story, not some of which he knew, and I said, I'm thinking of making this my career and teaching in college about it, but I'm going to get married, and we're going to have children, and I'm worried about the compensation. He said, oh, it's terrible, you'll starve, he says. So I said, oh. So I was so naive at that point. I said, but you've written 6 books. And by the time he died, he'd written about 20 books. So nobody reads those. So I said, absolutely dead on. All the scholars tell me that's absolutely right. So I said, I better make this my hobby, and I better go on to law school. All my mother, my father, my grandfather, my uncles were all lawyers. And I said, I better go on to a profession where I know I can make a living and keep this as my main hobby. So I went on to Columbia Law School, and that's murder. Anybody who's been to law school knows that the first year especially is impossible. You have almost no time of your own. So I used to go across the street on Saturday afternoons, about the only free time we had, to the East Asian Library of Columbia and read as much as I could about Southeast Asia. And this has continued for the last 45 years, I would say. I've read a lot of books and a lot of articles and listened to a lot of academic lectures, been a member of the Asia Society and the Burma Studies Group, and gone to Southeast Asia 8 times and taught the course here at Pioneer Spring. And next December, I'm going to lead a group of about 16 people for about 10 days to Myanmar, to Burma. So it's really become my hobby, and I've enjoyed teaching down here and in Norwalk, Connecticut. So that's the story of how I got hooked on this area. Think of the first question. Please ask the second question. Yes?
Well, I was wondering, how much of a threat are those armed groups?
Well, I don't think they're a threat to the Republic of the Philippines. They've been at it now, some of them, 40 years. What they're a threat to, really, is the attempt to have more human rights in the Philippines, because the reaction by the Philippine government up to now has been abuses by the army in tracking, for instance, the communists, and another group is a Muslim group in the 4 southern islands. So you have human rights abuses there. You've also had extrajudicial killings by probably paralegals out of uniform of perfectly legal left-wing communist supporters, perhaps, but who have broken no laws. Some of them have been assassinated. Nobody's been convicted of that or even tried for that. So it undermines that. You have another group, the group affiliated with Al-Qaeda is perhaps better financed, but there the United States sent 900 Marines right after 9/11 and that's the Abu Sayyaf group. They have more or less broken that group up into smaller components, killed a number of the leaders, arrested another group of the leaders, and I think they've marginalized Abu Sayyaf. That doesn't mean they're not there. They could set off bombs. They could still kidnap tourists, which they were doing right after 9/11. But I don't think it's a threat to the Republic. What it does is it saps, as I say, the Treasury. It requires a greater Philippine military than is necessary, and it leads to abuses of human rights. Yes?
How do you see the growing economic strength of this collection of nations impacting the U.S. economy?
Well, I think it would be a good idea if we entered into a free trade agreement with them as soon as we could. We have an arrangement with them. The reason it's not an agreement is it would require congressional approval, and members of Congress said they would not do that until Myanmar changed its human rights policies. But so we have an arrangement. People may not know. That's a kind of it's an informal, non-binding pact with a country or a group of countries in which we say, look, why don't you fellas, protect our intellectual property? That's one of the things Americans are concerned about. You know, Disney doesn't want its films knocked off 4 minutes after they come out, and then they're all over Southeast Asia for $1, you know, on discs. And we would like our pharmaceuticals protected, and we would like easier access by our corporations to form corporations in the various countries. Well, we have such an arrangement now with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN, but it's non-enforceable. It's just the goodwill of both sides. I think it would help to do that. I think we're on the right track in that we now have an ambassador to ASEAN. All these countries have an ambassador. It's good to have someone in Jakarta, near the Secretariat, that can discuss issues with ASEAN. And we've started coming to their meetings again. They have various levels of meetings besides when the 10 of them meet. They also meet, they have a group where they meet with their other non-ASEAN neighbors. Japan, Korea, China, New Zealand, Australia. And they further expanded that they now meet with the U.S. and with Europe. And these are larger and larger blocks talking about common problems, both trade, anti-terrorism, anti-piracy. For a period of time, Condoleezza Rice didn't go, but now Mrs. Clinton is gone. President Obama finally came to the meetings. All of that is important. I think it's a large market, and they're getting more affluent. They could buy our goods. It may come to the point where even our cars could compete with the Japanese models over there. They certainly represent still a relatively inexpensive labor force that we could use to manufacture our goods abroad. It's an important block of people. One of the things we've done, by the way, which is we've offered to help them in their dispute with the Chinese over the Spratly and Paracel Islands. You might wonder why there'd be such a tiff in the China Sea about small islands. The answer is, as you can maybe guess, they've discovered oil and gas under the South China Sea seabed. And the Chinese immediately claimed the entire seabed as Chinese property and sent down a little submarine to put a flag on the seabed, Chinese flag. Well, Vietnam, at least, and maybe Malaysia, have long-time claims to those islands. And things got a little rough. The Chinese started arresting Vietnamese fishermen who had to put into port in those small islands to avoid storms. And the Chinese have built an airfield on one of the islands and a military base on the other. So Secretary Clinton went to the ASEAN meeting and said, look, we will try to help you in your negotiations with the Chinese if you want. I think that's a good step. I don't know whether ASEAN will take us up on that. We have more military-to-military contacts now with some of these countries, which is interesting. With Singapore, with Cambodia, even. Our army has been helping the Cambodian army. The Cambodian army is no day at the beach when it comes to human rights violations, but so there's a trade-off on all this. But at least where we have more of a presence today there in Southeast Asia than we had 3 years ago. But I think it's a market, and I think we could get into it more. We're in fourth position now. We were at one time first. Yes?
So you get off the ship and you're in America.
Yeah.
How are you going to be greeted, and what's your safety?
I think you are safe in all these countries. I don't know, there are parts maybe where you wouldn't want to go. Some of the rural areas of the southern Philippine Islands where Abu Sayyaf is still active, you might not want to be there. But generally I have found there's no problem in the person-to-person relationship at all. Southeast Asian people generally are very friendly. They've said to me on occasion, we know you came a long way. We know how long that flight is. And some of them have invited me into their homes for dinner. I just happened to strike up a conversation, or I met their son who's come back for a visit, and I get invited to dinner. I don't think there's a problem. I think there's less of a problem now than during the Bush years. That I've noticed too. I wouldn't downplay the multilateral approach and the fact that Obama spent some time in Indonesia. All of those things, I think, are a plus. I think it's less of a plus now than when Obama was elected. I think the bloom is off the rose a little bit, I will admit. Everyone is disturbed about our recession. I mean, there's no doubt that when Western Europe and the United States couldn't buy as much from Southeast Asia, they suffered. They suffered quite